Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning. This is Jonathan Adviento. This is Module 8, Assignment 1 for CYS577 at Excelsior College. And I have titled it, Doing Business with China. So our scope for today, we're going to discuss the pros of doing business with China based on their steadily increasing GDP and the rise of their middle class. We're going to take a look at the impact of the 2016 China cybersecurity law on business. And we're also going to take a look at some cybersecurity benchmarks to check out their cybersecurity posture and how it's changed since the passing of the law using the National Exposure Index and the Global Cybersecurity Index. And lastly, we're going to take a look at a little company down here, Google, if you've heard of them. We're going to take a look at why, after entering the Chinese market to create and maintain a search engine in China in 2006, why they had to pull out in 2010, and why they have not stopped their efforts to try to enter, or re-enter the Chinese market up until today. And at the end, I'm going to tell you some information that is current here in 2019, some news that has popped up last month, late July, here in 2019. All right, the Chinese GDP. It is the second highest GDP in the world at 15.5 trillion. Now, if we compare that to the US at 20.5 trillion, there's a little bit of a gap there, but they've maintained the second highest GDP. They've had a steady rise in their GDP with an average of 9% per year over the past 30 years. It is said that their GDP increase is due to worker efficiency, which is driving the force of the consistency of the increase per year. The only change that we've seen, and it may be due to tensions between China and the US, trade tensions that is, we've seen the lowest increase in the last 27 years at 6.2%. That was this past year. And then of course, if we compare that to the US, the reason why our GDP is so high is because of higher average wages, population growth, and entrepreneurship. Now this is a little bit relative here because if we take a look at the GDP of China, that average wage is going to be changing, ever so changing over time, which we'll talk about a little bit later, because of the shift of the middle class. All right, so we're going to break down the Chinese market. They have a population of over 1.3 billion people. 72% of that population is of working age, with only 9% of them unemployed. And this is key here. This is the shift that I was talking about. The rise of the middle class. More and more people are moving into the cities and to work in the cities. And working in the city means a higher average wage, or correction, working in the city provides a higher wage, which means that the average overall is rising. From 2002 to 2012, the middle class rose from 4% of the working population to 31% of the working population. Okay, so we're going to move on to the National Exposure Index. So now that we know that we have a large market, it's kind of a no-brainer if you think of it from a business perspective only. We'll say, well, that's a huge market and the middle class is rising. We want to be able to attack that market because they're going to have a lot more spending power compared to a lot of smaller countries with less population. So if you think about 72% of 1.3 billion people, and 31% of that working class are middle class, and the middle class is rising, we want to take advantage of that. Problem is, we also want to take a look at how their security holds up. That's kind of our job here. Now, if we look at the National Exposure Index, this is a benchmark that looks at the exposure of the country based on the number of services that they offer that are unencrypted or unacceptable for use, and also their geopolitical region, how much of a risk they are. I don't have it listed on the slide here, but the United States is number 1, followed closely by China, ranked number 2 exposed country in the world. Now, if we have to take it with a grain of salt. What that means is, if we have the highest exposure, in order to combat that, we have to have the best security, which moves on to our next topic here of the Global Cybersecurity Index. Now, this would be the other half, or what I would consider to be the other half of the National Exposure Index. So the Cybersecurity Index takes 25 indicators and puts it into a single benchmark. And there are 193 countries that participate in this benchmark. And again, I don't have it listed here on my slide, but the United States is number 1. So if you look at, okay, the United States is the most exposed country, but we have the best cybersecurity index, therefore we are well protected against that exposure. Now, China is number 2 exposed. Back in 2015, they were 14th ranked in the world, and current day last year, 2018, they had dropped. Let me take a look at my notes here. They dropped down to 27th globally. Now, that's comparatively to other countries, okay? Now, if we look at 2015, which is before the cybersecurity law, to 2018, which is after the cybersecurity law passed in China, their score almost doubled. They went from 0.441 to 0.824. Now, if we look at the numbers in the United States, we went from a 0.8 to a 0.9. So if we were to take a look at it, China caught up to the United States score, but because the United States score also rose and all the countries around also rose, that's why the rankings are a little bit skewed, because compared to other countries, they seem less prepared. But if you think about it, their cybersecurity law is fairly new, but if you look at and isolate China specifically, you'll see that their score went from 0.441 to 0.824, so that's almost double. So the Global Cybersecurity Index focuses on 5 pillars. You have legal measures, technical measures, organizational measures, capacity measures, and cooperation. Okay. So the legal measures, we're looking at the punitive framework. So do we have a system in place that specifies in cybercrime? And then the legislative framework is the capability to create legislation for cybersecurity specifically. Now, the basis of the evaluation we're taking a look at the number of legal institutions and frameworks that we have available to create punitive measures and legislative measures. Now, the technical aspect, we're taking a look at the mechanisms that are in place for detection and response. So this includes, but is not limited to, the accreditation programs for systems, government entities that are designed for cyber incidents, a framework for incident response practices, things like that. Now, the organizational measure, we're taking a look at the presence of agencies and strategy related to cybersecurity. So we're looking at agencies that specialize in forming strategy, governance, and supervision. Capacity measures, we look at the number of programs available for education and training. Last but not least, cooperation, which may not be as strong of a suit for China. We're looking at the number of partnerships and frameworks for sharing information. As we know, the Great Cyberwall of China, they not only want to restrict what comes into the country, they also want to restrict what leaves the country. So they may not be as susceptible to sharing as other countries would, which might be the cause of their score going down some. Okay, so let's take a look at the China cybersecurity law itself. It is 7 chapters with 79 articles. Besides the general provisions, as you can see, they have a lot of the same themes that we see in our own cybersecurity law. Support and promotion of network security, network operation security, information security, monitoring and early warnings and early responses, legal responsibility, and supplementary provisions. Now you can see that a lot of the requirements, or not requirements, but the benchmarks that are used in the Global Cybersecurity Index are being covered in the new cybersecurity law, and which is why there's an indication of the increase in the index score from 2015 to 2018. So we have an example of before the law was passed and a couple years after the law was passed, because it was passed in 2016 and went into effect in 2017. Okay, so the China cybersecurity law, it covers all businesses in China, both foreign and domestic. So if we're a foreign company going in there, they will require to have databases in country if you're going to be operating a business in China. Some of the things that are controversial with their law is that the Chinese government reserves a lot of power to themselves in the name of security, also in the name of censorship, to protect minors, things of that nature. They reserve the right to perform spot checks of networks, which includes requiring full access to data stored locally in China. So this includes everything. This includes sensitive information. This includes private information and potentially intellectual property. The same type of access must be provided to the Chinese government during cybercrime investigations. So the potential for a conflict of interest or an ethical conflict of interest where the same country or government entity, I should say, that owns a lot of the assets in the country is now going in and being able to look at the information that's in the competition's database. And the concern is, well, the government, since they own your competition, will just go in, do a spot check, steal your intellectual property, copy it, and produce it before you can even go into production, therefore skipping the R&D stage and going straight into production because they have the blueprints, they have everything that they need. But when you think about it, the reason why it's written is so that they can be efficient at checking to make sure that your software is in compliance with their cultural needs, with their law, which does include a form of censorship, which does include filtering content and things of that nature. All right, so let's take a look at Google. So Google made its first attempt to run a search engine in China in 2006. After a cyber attack that happened within the country, a Gmail account of Chinese human rights activists were hacked, which caused, I remember this specifically around that time era. I believe I was in my early 20s. I remember my specific Gmail account was also hacked at that point of time, which caused a lot of people to have to recover their accounts, things like that. But because of this attack, and because of censorship laws, they had to rethink doing business in China. In fact, Google had rerouted all their traffic to a version of their search engine in China that's unfiltered versus the one that's in country that is filtered. When the Chinese government cut off access to this specific search engine that was based out of Hong Kong or filtered through Hong Kong, Google decided to pull out completely. After that happened, the thing about it, this is 2010, they still have not stopped the efforts to do so. Okay, so in last year there was some news about a secret project called Dragonfly. This was basically Google trying to go back to China, and they were going to say, okay, we're going to comply to your censorship requirements, we're going to comply to your new cybersecurity law, and we'd want to do business. I mean, if you think about it, they have a large market basis. Facebook is already there, so why not China, or why not Google? Sadly, though, and this is current news. This was late July, after a Senate hearing here in the United States. Google had officially stated that they have canceled the Dragonfly program. Okay, so there was a lot of pushback about conforming to authoritarian style of censorship. The ethics of censorship. You know, is it okay to do this just to do business in China? But this is not necessarily a cybersecurity problem. This becomes an ethics problem. So we're gonna wrap up our final thoughts here. If we take a look at the trend in China, we see that the GCI is going in the right direction. We know that the GDP is still going to be consistent, even though it has been the lowest and it has been in years. It's still increasing. So you're seeing a GDP that's ever increasing. They have a formula that works, despite big changes in the middle class. But because of those changes in the middle class, you're having a large group of people that has a large buying power. So it's very enticing to do business there. But the problem that you run into is Western ethical mindset. We think about privacy. We think about sensitive information. Our very own CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So it becomes an ethical problem, or a perceived ethical problem, because in China they have no problem with the way that they run things, whereas we may view it as an ethical problem, not a security problem. So I would say or suggest that we can proceed, but with caution. We may have to think about duality. Do we want to create a product or a version that is compliant with China? So right here, this is what I wrote. Create a Chinese version of your company to tap the Chinese market the same way Google was thinking of doing it. And the only reason that they got stopped was because they weren't necessarily ready to comply with the level of censorship that China is requiring. Now the funny thing is the news started to ramp up a little bit late last year, about Project Dragonfly, and there was some speculation about the change in Google's mentality. There was, I'm trying to think of their motto. Their motto was "Don't be evil," and if we think of things that are unethical, we also think of that as synonymous with evil. Well, the "Don't be evil" motto was removed from their employee code of conduct in spring of 2018, last year. So, what is this coincidence? Is this conspiracy? Unsure. As they were trying, obviously they were already in talks with China at this point. So it's really market driven. So we know that the security is right. We just don't know if the ethics are there. So that's really up to you and your company to create a product that is China approved, if you will. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. And I'm going to provide a copy of this PowerPoint presentation, which includes all these references here. Have a good evening and have a good night.